The phone rang at 3:47 in the morning. I know the exact time because I was still awake, staring at the ceiling of my darkened bedroom, watching shadows that weren't there. That's what insomnia does to you after weeks of it. It doesn't just steal sleep. It steals the distinction between dreaming and waking. Your mind becomes this fractured thing, simultaneously exhausted and racing, and your body stops trusting you to know the difference between what's real and what you've conjured from fear. I reached for the phone without hesitation, the way you do when you're already half sure the call itself is a hallucination, but it wasn't. Harrison? The voice was Rebecca's. Rebecca Chun, Vice President of Operations at Meridian Technologies, the company where I'd spent 20 years building something that felt like a monument to my own competence, my own value, my own desperate need to prove that a man like me, a man who'd started from nothing, could climb high enough to touch the sky. My ex-wife used to say I was trying to outrun my own childhood and not climb. Maybe she was right. Are you awake? Of course she was asking if I was awake. The time made it absurd. But that's how Rebecca communicated. She asked obvious questions because she was already thinking 3 moves ahead, already calculating how you'd respond, already weaponizing whatever vulnerability your answer revealed. I'd worked with her for 15 years. She knew my sleep had been disintegrating for weeks. She knew because I'd started making mistakes in meetings, small ones, the kind that accumulate like frost on a windshield until suddenly you can't see through. What's happened? I didn't ask how she got my personal number at this hour. She had every number. She collected access the way other people collected trophies. There was a pause. Not the pause of someone gathering courage. The pause of someone deciding how much to say, how much to reveal, what narrative would serve her purposes best. I'd been in corporate America long enough to recognize that particular quality of silence. It was the silence of calculated revelation. Thomas Rothstein wants to see you first thing, she said. 7 a.m., his office. He told me to tell you not to discuss this with anyone. The blood moved differently through my body then. I felt it shift, felt my heart respond with a spike of something that wasn't quite panic, but was definitely fear. Thomas Rothstein was Chief Operating Officer, third in command, a man I'd spoken to perhaps a dozen times in my entire career, despite working in the same company. Men like Rothstein didn't summon men like me at 7 in the morning. Men like Rothstein didn't summon anyone at 7 in the morning without it being something that mattered, something that cut, something that drew blood. Rebecca, what is this about? Just be there, she said, and hung up. I lay in the dark for another hour after that. My mind doing what minds do when they're terrified, it created scenarios. It imagined outcomes. It drew parallels to things I'd read about, articles about executive purges, reorganizations, the slow-motion executions that corporations performed on people they decided were no longer valuable. I was 52 years old. I was at an age where being fired wasn't a setback. It was a trajectory change. I was at an age where the world wasn't particularly interested in hiring people like me, where the market preferred its workers younger and hungrier and willing to accept less money for the same work. I was at an age where time wasn't infinite anymore, where each decision carried the weight of finality, where mistakes couldn't simply be learned from and moved past because there might not be enough future left to build something better. When I finally got out of bed at 5 a.m., my body had that particular stiffness that comes from not moving for hours, from stress hormones keeping your muscles clenched even in sleep. I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror. I looked like what I was, a man who hadn't slept properly in weeks, whose face had started to develop that middle-aged slackness that comes when your skin can no longer hold itself up with the same certainty it once did. My eyes had broken capillaries from the pressure of insomnia and anxiety. My hair, which had been dark when I was younger, was now mostly gray, and I could see my father's face in mine if I looked at the right angle. My father who'd worked warehouse jobs his whole life and died at 63 wondering if he'd accomplished anything at all. The shower didn't help. Cold water, hot water, none of it mattered. What I needed was the ability to rewind time, to change the decisions that had led to this 3:47 a.m. phone call, to understand what I'd done wrong. Because there had to be something I'd done wrong. No one called your private number at that hour with good news. No one told you not to discuss things with colleagues unless something was being dismantled behind the scenes. I arrived at Meridian's offices at 6:45 a.m. The building was mostly empty, just the obsessives and the anxious, the people like me who had nowhere better to be. The lobby was all glass and steel, designed to project confidence and modernity, though what it really projected was sterility, the feeling that you were inside a machine rather than a building where humans worked. Meridian made software, enterprise resource planning systems, data analytics platforms, the unglamorous infrastructure that corporations needed to function. We weren't building anything that changed the world. We were building systems that made other systems work better, faster, more efficiently. Thomas Rothstein's office was on the 42nd floor, corner office with views that sprawled across the entire city. He was already there when I arrived, standing with his back to me, looking out at the morning light hitting the buildings across from us. Rothstein was younger than me by about 8 years, early 40s, the kind of executive who'd been fast-tracked since his 20s. He was wearing a suit that probably cost more than my car payment. He didn't turn around immediately when I entered. "Harrison," he finally said, turning with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Thanks for coming in early." "Of course," I said, "because what else do you say?" The smile was the worst part. It was the smile of someone about to explain something difficult, someone who'd already decided your fate and was simply going through the formality of telling you about it. He gestured to a chair across from his desk, and I sat. The desk was clean, aggressively clean. No family photos, no personal artifacts, nothing that suggested this was a space where a human being worked rather than where decisions were executed. Everything was surfaces. Everything was performance. "How long have you been with Meridian?" Rothstein asked. 20 years, I said. "Do you enjoy it here?" The question was so clearly a setup that I almost laughed. But I didn't laugh. At 52, you learn that laughter in tense situations usually signals weakness, and weakness is the thing that predators respond to. So I gave him the answer that seemed safest. "I've had a good career here," I said. "Built a lot." Rothstein nodded as if I'd confirmed something he already knew. He opened a folder on his desk, physical paper, not digital, which meant this was official and documented, which meant this was something that had legal implications. "I wanted to talk to you about your recent performance. Your managers have expressed some concerns." "What managers? What concerns?" "I'd been exceeding my targets. My quarterly reviews had been positive. My team had been delivering. But I'd learned in 20 years that performance metrics are fungible, that they mean only what people decide they mean, and that once the narrative shifts, nothing you've built can protect you." The narrative had shifted. I could feel it the way you feel temperature change before a storm. "What kind of concerns?" I asked. "Engagement. Attendance at strategic planning meetings. Your engagement with your team seems to be diminishing." This was insane. I was in every meeting that mattered. My team was consistently ranked in the top 10% of the company. But I recognized what was happening. This was the setup. This was the moment where they justify what they've already decided, where they take your strengths and reframe them as weaknesses, where they take the normal fluctuations of a nearly 20-year career and convert them into evidence of decline. "I don't think that's accurate," I said. "My team's metrics are strong. I'm meeting all my targets." Rothstein leaned back in his chair. "I know. That's why we're promoting you." The words landed like something physical. I felt them in my chest, felt my brain struggle to reinterpret what I was hearing. Promoting, not firing. Not demoting, promoting. But the way he said it, with that particular cadence, with that specific tone, it was the worst thing he could have said. "We're creating a new role," Rothstein continued. Chief Strategy Officer for Digital Transformation. It's a big opportunity, Harrison. It comes with an expanded team, a larger budget, visibility at the executive level. We think you're exactly the person to lead this. The blood moved again, different this time. Not fear, something stranger, something like vertigo. I'd been at the company long enough to recognize what a chief strategy officer role meant. It meant a title without institutional power. It meant being moved away from line responsibilities where you actually controlled something and into a staff role where you had visibility but no authority. It meant visibility that made you a target, responsibility without control. It was a beautiful knife. When would this happen? I asked. Immediately. We'd want you to transition this week. You'd report directly to me. And we're looking at making this a full executive team position within the next quarter. Immediately. Not next month. Not after a transition period. This week. Which meant everything was already decided. Which meant people were already being told about this. Which meant Rebecca had already known when she called at 3:47 a.m. Which meant she was warning me, or preparing me, or setting me up. I couldn't tell which. I'd like some time to think about this, I said. Rothstein's expression changed. Something flickered across his face, and I recognized it as surprise. People didn't ask for time to think about promotions. People said yes. People were grateful. The fact that I was hesitating had violated some unspoken script. Take the weekend, he said. But I need an answer Monday. I left his office in a state that I can only describe as fractured. My mind was splitting off into multiple simultaneous tracks, one processing the logistical details, one trying to understand the political implications, one spiraling into the anxiety that had been my baseline for weeks now. I took the elevator down to the street level and walked for 2 hours without really seeing where I was going. The city moved around me. People rushed to their destinations. The morning became the afternoon. I ended up in a coffee shop that I didn't remember entering, sitting at a table with a cup I didn't remember ordering, staring at nothing. What I understood, sitting in that coffee shop, was that something had shifted. The comfortable narrative I'd been telling myself, the story of a competent man with a stable career, a man who'd built something durable, a man who'd survived the disruptions and reorganizations that had decimated his colleagues. That narrative had just become fiction, because you don't get promoted and immediately repositioned and made visible all at once unless someone has already decided what's going to happen next. And the thing that was going to happen next wasn't going to be good. By Monday morning, I'd made my decision. I called Rothstein's assistant and said yes. The transition happened with a speed that felt almost obscene. I was moved to a new office smaller than my previous one, positioned away from the main executive area, with a window that looked at a building rather than the city. My team was restructured before I could even meet all of them. My budget was approved. My mandate was given to me in vague terms that sounded impressive but meant nothing. Drive strategic transformation. Identify emerging opportunities. Bridge the gap between our legacy systems and next-generation platforms. Every phrase was designed to be so broad that it couldn't be measured, which meant it couldn't be achieved, which meant I would eventually fail at it. It took me 3 weeks to understand what was actually happening. 3 weeks of meetings where I noticed I wasn't invited to. Conversations that stopped when I entered rooms. Emails where I was copied but not included in the substantive discussion. My colleagues were still there, still working in their roles, but something had shifted in how they interacted with me. There was a distance now. There was caution. There was the particular coldness that people adopt when they sense someone is on their way down. I started noticing things more acutely during the 4th week. Small things that probably didn't mean anything individually, but which, when accumulated, began to form a pattern. A meeting that I wasn't told about until it was over. A decision about resource allocation that contradicted what I'd been asked to prioritize. A new hire, a very young woman named Sophia, fresh out of an elite MBA program who was technically supposed to report to someone else, but who seemed to spend a lot of time in Thomas's office. The fifth week was when I started actually paying attention. I was working late one evening, alone in the office except for the cleaning crew. My new role had been deliberately structured to give me visibility but no direct operating responsibility, which meant most of my days were meetings where I was presented with other people's work and asked to comment on it. I wasn't used to the idleness. 20 years of my career had been spent in roles where I directly controlled something, a team, a budget, a product line. This new role was performative, and I was starting to see the performance for what it was. I was in the company intranet, ostensibly looking for some documentation about our cloud infrastructure when I noticed something. There was a directory for a project called Meridian Future that I'd never heard of. Nothing unusual about that companies have thousands of projects. But this directory was buried 3 levels deep in the organizational structure, and it had files updated today. While I was in a meeting about transformation strategy, someone was actively working on something called Meridian Future, and I didn't know what it was. I opened it. The first thing I saw was a presentation deck. The title slide said, Strategic Restructuring, Phase 2. I opened a PDF. What I read in the next 20 minutes changed something fundamental in how I understood what was happening to me. The presentation was a reorganization plan, not the kind of reorganization that happens annually during the normal budget cycle. This was a targeted restructuring, and the target was clear in the document's own terms. Eliminate legacy organizational structures and associated overhead. Eliminate, not modernize. Not streamline, eliminate. My division, the division I built from scratch 15 years ago, was marked for integration into a new structure that didn't appear to include me. The roles, the responsibilities, the people, they would all be redistributed. Everyone in my division except me would move into reporting structures under people who currently reported to me, which meant I would have no direct reports. Which meant I would have no actual responsibilities, which meant I would have no power, and there was more. Pages and pages of detailed plans, timelines. The new Chief Strategy Officer role that I just accepted was listed as transition position for executive retiring in 2026. Retiring. They weren't firing me. They were parking me in a visible role for 3 years while my actual authority was systematically dismantled. And then they would let me retire with my benefits intact and a clean story about how I'd chosen to step aside. It was such a perfect knife. It was so well designed. It had taken them weeks to set it up, the initial promotion to get me out of my power base, the visibility to make me look important while I was actually being hollowed out. The strategic positioning so that by the time anyone actually noticed what was happening, it would already be too late. I sat in my empty office in the middle of the night, reading a document that wasn't supposed to exist for me, and I felt something shift in my chest. It wasn't anger. It was worse than anger. It was clarity. It was the sudden, devastating understanding that you'd been playing a game you didn't know had rules, and the rules had been written to ensure you would lose. Rebecca had known. That's what the 3:47 a.m. call meant. That's why she'd used those specific words. Thomas Rothstein wants to see you first thing. She'd been trying to warn me without actually warning me, giving me information in the form of a phone call that was deniable. Rebecca had been in the meetings about this. She was part of the restructuring, and she'd given me just enough information to know it was coming, but not enough to actually stop it. The question was, why? I printed the document. I don't know why I did that, looking back. It was an instinctive action, physical evidence, something I could hold in my hands. I knew I shouldn't have accessed it, shouldn't have printed it, but at that point, what did it matter? I was already scheduled to be dismantled. The next morning, I did something that I now recognize as either brilliant or catastrophically stupid. I called Rebecca and asked her to meet me for coffee. She agreed immediately. No hesitation. No, I'm busy. Just, where? We met at a cafe 3 blocks from the office, one that was neutral territory, not a place where anyone we worked with would typically go. Rebecca arrived looking exactly as she always did, composed, impeccably dressed, with the particular exhaustion that comes from being a woman in executive roles who has to work twice as hard and twice as carefully as men do. She was around my age, mid-50s, and she carried that in her posture, the particular weariness of someone who'd been fighting the same battles for decades and had learned to make peace with the fact that you never fully win them. "You found the Meridian Future Directory," she said. It wasn't a question. I didn't deny it. There was no point. "You knew what they were planning." "Yes." "Why didn't you tell me?" Rebecca stirred her coffee with a deliberation that suggested she was buying time, or perhaps that the question was more complicated than it appeared to be. "Because I couldn't tell you without becoming complicit in your knowing something you shouldn't know. And because I need my job. They're eliminating my division. They're eliminating me. They're transitioning your division," Rebecca said carefully. "You're keeping your title. You're keeping your salary. You're keeping your benefits. For 3 years, you get to have a visible executive role without the stress of actually managing anything. Most people would consider that a gift. Most people aren't me," I said. Rebecca set down her coffee and looked at me directly. Something shifted in her expression. She was deciding something. I could see the calculation happening in real time. She was weighing loyalty against self-interest, probably weighing it as she'd been trained to weigh it in 2 decades of corporate experience. "They're not done," she said quietly. "This was just the first phase. There's a second phase that they'll initiate in about 6 months. That's when they start pressuring you to take early retirement. That's when the real elimination happens." "How do you know this?" "Because I was in the room when they planned it. Thomas Rothstein and Martin Cross and 2 board members you've never even spoken to. They were very explicit about the timeline. Martin Cross was CEO. Martin Cross had hired me. 20 years ago, I'd interviewed with Martin Cross and impressed him with my ideas about scalable development platforms, and he'd taken a chance on me. I'd been younger then, hungrier. I'd been someone with things to prove. Now I was someone who'd already proven them, and apparently that made me expendable. Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Rebecca looked down at her coffee. "Because it's wrong. Because I'm tired of watching it happen. Because the last 3 people they did this to all ended up in worse positions, and I don't want to see it happen again. And because ... she trailed off. Because what? Because I'm probably next," she said quietly. "I'm 55. I'm expensive. I have opinions. I don't always agree. They've already started the social undermining. Meetings where I'm not included. Decisions made without my input. It's the same process. They're just doing it faster with me." I felt something shift in how I understood the situation. This wasn't personal. It wasn't about me. It was systematic. It was a machine that had been designed to chew up people like us middle-aged, experienced, expensive, people who'd been in the company long enough to have institutional memory and enough power to ask uncomfortable questions. "What do I do?" I asked. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment. "Document everything. Every decision they make about your division. Every meeting where you're excluded. Every email where your authority is circumvented. Build a record. Because if you're going to fight this, you need evidence. And when you do fight it, you'll need people like me who can corroborate what was happening." "Fight it how?" "Go to the board. Go to HR. Go to a lawyer. I don't know exactly how. But don't just accept it and retire quietly. That's what they want you to do. That's the scenario they've built, and if you follow it, you're just playing the part they've written for you." I left that coffee meeting with my mind moving in a direction it hadn't gone in years. I'd spent my career accepting the systems as they were, working within them, trying to be successful by the metrics they established. But what if the metrics themselves were the problem? What if the success I'd achieved was actually just evidence of my own complicity in my own dismantling? When I got back to my office, I sat at my desk and created a new folder on my computer. I labeled it Documentation. Then I started collecting everything: emails, memos, meeting notes, calendar invitations that I wasn't included in. I wasn't even sure what I was building toward. But Rebecca was right about one thing. You couldn't fight something you couldn't prove. The next week, I was invited to a meeting about the future direction of my division's key product line. The meeting was in a conference room with 10 people, and I was noticeably the least informed person in the room. Everyone else had obviously been in discussions about this already. They referenced decisions that had been made, directions that had been chosen, all of which I was encountering for the first time. I sat through the meeting and took notes and didn't say much. When it was over, I walked out with a colleague named Marcus. Marcus had reported to me until about 3 weeks ago, and now he reported to someone new. Marcus was a good person, competent, but like everyone else, he was reading the room. He was reading the writing on the wall. "That was strange," Marcus said as we walked toward the elevator. "Which part?" "The way they just told you about decisions that were already made. Usually you'd be part of that conversation." "I would have thought so too," I said. The elevator doors opened. Marcus hesitated before stepping in. Then he said, quietly, "Harrison, I don't want to overstep, but you should be careful right now. There's been talk." "Talk about what?" "About you. About your role. About whether a chief strategy officer position actually makes sense long term. I'm telling you this because you gave me a chance when I was starting out, and I respect you. So I'm telling you, they're moving faster than anyone expected. If you're going to do something, do it now." The elevator doors closed. I stood in the hallway feeling the particular paralysis that comes when you know something is wrong, but you're not sure how to correct it. What was I going to do? Go to HR? HR answered to the same people who were planning this. Go to the board? I didn't have access to the board. Go to a lawyer? For what? For being promoted to a role that wasn't aligned with my previous responsibilities. That wasn't illegal. It was just ruthless. That evening, I sat in my apartment drinking whiskey and thinking about time. I'm 52 years old. That meant I probably had 30 or 40 years of life left, if I'm lucky. But in terms of career, in terms of being employable, being valuable, being the kind of person that a company would want to hire, I probably had 5, maybe 10 years. And the scenario they'd built was going to consume the next 3 of those years, leaving me with 7 years, maybe 12, to rebuild something in a market that was already skeptical of people my age. I thought about my son, who was 28 and working in tech, already more successful than I'd been at his age. I thought about whether I was building anything for him by quietly accepting this, or whether I was just teaching him that you accept the systems as they are. I thought about my ex-wife, who'd been right about a lot of things, including the observation that I was running from my own childhood through achievement. And I thought about the version of me that was younger, hungrier, the one who'd taken risks and believed in fighting for things that mattered. That version of me had been dormant for years, but maybe he wasn't entirely gone. By the next morning, I decided on a course of action. It was risky. It was probably going to fail. But the alternative was to accept the role they'd written for me and play the part until they decided I was done. I called a lawyer, a woman named Sarah Chun, who specialized in employment law. We met in her office, and I explained the situation. I showed her the documentation I'd collected. I told her about the Meridian Future Directory and the restructuring plan that had my division marked for elimination. She listened carefully, taking notes, asking questions that were clearly designed to assess the legal strength of my position. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and looked at me with an expression that suggested she was trying to decide how much truth I could handle. "Here's the situation," she said. "What they're doing is probably legal. A company is allowed to reorganize. A company is allowed to move people into different roles. A company is allowed to restructure. None of that violates employment law. Unless, and this is the key, unless they're doing it as retaliation for something protected. Or unless you have a contract that specifies what your role should be. I don't have a contract beyond the standard employment agreement, I said. Then you don't have a strong legal case. What you have is a business ethics case, which is valuable. But it's not something that a court is going to care about. So I have no options. I didn't say that. You have options. But they're not legal options. They're strategic options. She leaned forward. You could go to the board. Not HR. Not your CEO. The board. You could make a case that the restructuring is not in the company's best interests, that it's costing them institutional knowledge, that it's a short-sighted move. You could present data about your team's performance, your division's contributions, the value that you represent to the organization. Would that work? Maybe. Probably not. But it's possible. Corporate boards are mostly concerned with one thing: shareholder value. If you can make the case that what they're doing is destroying shareholder value, there's a chance someone listens. Not a good chance, but a chance. How would I do that? You'd request a formal meeting with the board's audit committee. You'd present your case. You'd bring documentation. You'd be professional and measured, and you'd focus on facts rather than emotion. You'd be the adult in the room, which is the position you need to occupy when you're going against your CEO. I left her office feeling both hopeful and terrified. Hopeful because there was actually something I could do. Terrified because doing it would essentially declare war on the people who'd promoted me, who controlled my paycheck, who could make my life significantly more difficult if they decided to. But I also recognized something else. Sitting in my car outside her office, I recognized that I'd been waiting for permission. I'd been waiting for someone to tell me it was okay to fight for myself, okay to resist the narrative they'd written. And maybe that's what you learn when you're 52 and you've spent a decade gradually losing power sometimes. Nobody gives you permission. Sometimes you have to take it. It took me another week to gather the materials I needed. I compiled data on my division's performance metrics. I pulled reports about our contribution to the company's overall revenue and profitability. I created presentations that showed the timeline of my career, the value I delivered, the investments I'd made. I was building a case, in other words. I was building the story of why Harrison Blake was worth keeping around. And then I did something that surprised even me. I reached out to 5 other people in the company who I'd worked with extensively, people who I thought had some credibility with the board. I didn't explicitly ask them to support me. I just invited them to coffee and asked them what they thought about the company's direction, whether they thought the restructuring made strategic sense. I was testing the water, seeing if there were other people who'd seen what I'd seen, who understood that the process was flawed. 3 of the 5 said something very similar. They'd noticed the pattern. They'd seen other people moved into ceremonial roles. They'd watched the company sacrifice institutional knowledge for ... What, exactly? Lower costs? Liability reduction? Fear of people who ask questions? With those conversations completed, I did the most direct thing I'd done in years. I called James Whitmore. James Whitmore was the chair of Meridian's board. He was a man in his 70s who'd been involved with the company since its early days. He was also, as far as I knew, someone who still believed in things like institutional integrity and long-term thinking. His assistant said he was very busy but could give me 15 minutes next Tuesday. I used those 15 minutes carefully. I sat across from James Whitmore in a conference room in a downtown office tower, and I told him what I'd found. I told him about Meridian Future. I told him about the restructuring. I didn't tell him how I'd found the document. I just said I'd become aware of it. I told him that I believed the restructuring was strategically short-sighted and that it was going to cost the company valuable institutional knowledge. Whitmore listened to me with a particular expression of someone who is simultaneously thinking about multiple things at once. He didn't interrupt. He didn't defend the company's position. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. This is a delicate situation. he said finally. I understand, I said. Thomas brought this plan to us. The board approved it. If I question it now, I'm basically saying the board made a bad decision, which is possible, but it's also not a great look. I'm not asking you to question the board, I said. I'm asking you to consider whether this particular restructuring is aligned with what's actually best for the company. Whitmore leaned back in his chair. Have you considered that they might know something about the industry that you don't? That there might be reasons for moving people like you into advisory roles rather than operational ones? I've considered it, I said, but I haven't seen evidence of it. What I've seen is a systematic process that moves experienced people out of power and replaces them with cheaper, younger people. And I think that's short-term thinking. It is, Whitmore said. It's also how companies operate now. Costs are pressures. Shareholders demand continuous growth. The old model of institutional loyalty and long-term investment in people, that's increasingly incompatible with how capital markets work. So I'm just supposed to accept being dismantled? Whitmore looked at me directly. There was something like sympathy in his expression, or perhaps just recognition. No, he said. You're not, but you're also going to lose. The best you can do is lose with dignity and in a way that prevents them from destroying you completely. That's not what I was hoping to hear. I know, Whitmore said, but it's what's true. He was quiet for another moment, and then he said something that surprised me. I'm going to do something. I can't stop this restructuring. The board approved it. But I can ask questions about the timeline. I can suggest that we move slower, that we give your division more time to show what it's capable of under the new structure. That might buy you another quarter or two. But beyond that, Harrison, I think you need to start thinking about what comes next. What comes next? A new company, a new role, something you own rather than something that owns you. Because you're right about one thing, the market is changing. Institutional loyalty is dying. But what that means is that people like you need to stop looking for jobs and start building things. I left that meeting feeling defeated and energized in equal measure. Whitmore was right about the fundamental situation. I was going to lose. The system was designed to produce the outcome they'd already decided on, and there was no legal lever I could pull to stop it. But he was also right about something else. There might be an alternative to losing. There might be a choice that wasn't simply acceptance. Over the next month, things developed in a way that was almost scripted in its progression. Whitmore did exactly what he said he would do. He raised questions about the timing of the restructuring. He suggested that more data was needed about whether the new structure would actually work. The board decided to pilot the restructuring in my division only on a 6-month trial basis before implementing it company-wide. This was both a victory and a delay of the inevitable. It was a reprieve, not a reversal. During that same month, something else happened that I didn't anticipate. Rebecca was called into a meeting with HR and was informed that her position was being eliminated. The company was consolidating operations. Her role would be distributed across other people. She was offered a severance package that was generous, but ultimately calculated to persuade her not to fight too hard against the decision. Rebecca called me immediately after receiving the news. I guess they moved up the timeline for me, she said. 6 months faster than I expected. I'm sorry, I said. Don't be sorry. Be smart. What they did to me, they're going to do to you. And when that happens, you need to be ready. Ready for what? For the next thing. For what comes after this company. They're not going to let someone like you sit in a ceremonial role for 3 years and then politely let you go. It's not in their interest. They'll manufacture a reason to push you out faster. And when that happens, you need to have already decided what you're going to do with the rest of your life. Rebecca ended up taking her severance. She took 3 months off and then started consulting. Last I heard, she was doing well, probably better than she would have done if she'd stayed and fought the battle that was essentially unwinnable. The 6-month pilot of my division's restructuring began in August. My team was split up. Some people reported to different divisions. Some people were moved to new roles that weren't as well aligned with their skills. The structure I'd built over 15 years was dismantled and reassembled in a way that was technically functional but spiritually broken. And I watched it happen from my office, taking notes, building my documentation, understanding that I was watching the slow-motion execution of something I'd created. But something interesting started happening during those 6 months. As my division structure changed, as the team that I'd built was redistributed, the company's performance in that division actually declined, not catastrophically. Not enough to be immediately obvious, but measurable. The metrics that mattered, development velocity, bug rates, customer satisfaction, all drifted slightly downward. The new structure was technically correct, but it was missing something. It was missing the particular quality that comes from people who've worked together for years, who know each other's strengths and weaknesses, who've built trust over time. The board's data team noticed it. Whitmore brought it to my attention in a meeting in month 4 of the pilot. "Your division's metrics are declining," he said. "I've noticed," I said. "Do you know why?" "Because the people who made it work were distributed. Because continuity matters more than a lot of companies acknowledge. Because you can't just reorganize people like they're interchangeable parts." Whitmore nodded slowly. "Can you fix it?" "I could," I said. "But not within the constraints they've set up. Not with the reporting structure they've created." "What would you need?" I told him. I told him that I would need to have operational authority over my division again. I would need my team back under my direct management. I would need protection from being reorganized out again while I was rebuilding. It wasn't a reasonable request, exactly, but it was an honest one. Whitmore met with Thomas Rothstein. I'm not sure what their conversation was like. I was never told the details. But the outcome was that at month 5 of the 6-month pilot, I was called into Rothstein's office and offered a choice. "We're seeing some issues with the restructured division," Rothstein said. He sounded careful, like he was reading from a script that had been negotiated by lawyers. "We're wondering whether the original structure was more effective than we anticipated. We'd like you to take operational control of the division again." I felt something shift in my chest. This was not what I'd expected. This was actually something like victory. Not total victory, but real movement in my direction. "With what reporting structure?" I asked. "Directly to me," Rothstein said. "For now." "For how long?" "For as long as it takes to stabilize the division. Probably another 6 months. After that, we'll reassess." I considered this. I could take this offer and it would solve my immediate problem. It would restore my power, restore my division, give me back the thing I'd built. But it would also leave me in a position where I was dependent on Rothstein's goodwill, where I could be dismantled again as soon as it was convenient. "I want a 3-year contract," I said. "I want written assurance that my position isn't subject to restructuring." Without 30 days' notice and a cause and effect justification, Rothstein's expression shifted. "That's not standard." "I know. Neither is the way I've been treated. Neither is asking me to rebuild something that was deliberately dismantled." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll need to discuss that with the board." "Of course," I said. "I'll wait to hear from you." What happened next was unexpected. The negotiation that I thought would take weeks happened in days. The board approved a 3-year contract with exactly the protections I'd requested. More than that, they added a clause that specified that any major reorganization of my division would require board approval, not just executive sign-off. I'd won. Or more precisely, I'd survived, and through surviving, I'd managed to force the system to acknowledge that I had value and that my value was worth protecting in writing. When I accepted the contract and started rebuilding my division, something changed in how people treated me. I was no longer on my way out. I was back on my way up. Or perhaps more accurately, I was simply back. And the people who'd been waiting to see if I would fail suddenly started treating me like someone worth knowing again. But it was during this same period that something else became clear to me. In fighting this battle, in documenting the restructuring, in going to the board, in negotiating the contract, I'd learned something about myself that I wasn't entirely sure I liked. I'd learned that I could operate in this world. I could play the game. I could win small victories through leverage and careful negotiation. But I'd also learned that winning these small victories didn't actually make me happy. It didn't make me feel satisfied. It just made me feel like I'd bought myself a few more years in a system that was fundamentally broken. I was sitting in my apartment on a Saturday evening, 6 months after my contract was finalized, thinking about this. I was alone. My wife had left years ago, tired of competing with my work for my attention. My son rarely called, probably tired of the story I'd been telling myself about how important my job was, how valuable my career was. I was 52 years old and I just spent the last 6 months fighting to keep a job that wasn't actually making me happy, fighting to keep a career that was fundamentally built on competition and hierarchy and the constant fear of being replaced. The phone rang. It was Sophia, the young woman who'd been fast-tracked into the executive track, the one who'd spent all that time in Thomas's office during the months of my dismantling. She was calling to ask me to write her a recommendation letter for a new role at another company. She was leaving. She'd gotten an offer that she couldn't refuse, and she wanted my endorsement. I wrote her the recommendation. She was competent, after all. She deserved the opportunity. And something about her leaving gave me permission to ask myself a question I'd been avoiding. What was I staying for? That night, I sat down and started writing. Not a formal resignation letter, just thoughts, observations, questions about what the last 20 years had meant, what I'd built, what I'd sacrificed. I wrote about my son, about how I'd been present physically in his life but absent in every other way because I was always thinking about work, always worrying about position, always calculating how my next move would affect my trajectory. I wrote about the version of myself who'd been hungry and ambitious, and the version of myself who'd become frightened and defensive. I wrote about what it meant to spend 20 years building something and then to have that something gradually dismantled piece by piece, even when you'd managed to fight back and restore it. I didn't have answers to any of these questions, but the act of asking them, of putting them into words, changed something. I recognized that I had options that I'd stopped considering years ago. I could stay with Meridian. I had a contract. I had power. I had a salary that was comfortable. But I didn't have to. I could also leave. I could do something else. I could build something that wasn't dependent on a corporation's goodwill or a board's approval. The question was, what would I build? I spent the next 2 weeks having conversations with people I respected. People who'd left corporate environments and built their own things. People who'd taken risks and failed and rebuilt and succeeded. And I started to hear a common thread. Almost all of them said that they'd spent the last decade in corporate roles terrified of what would happen if they left. And almost all of them said that when they finally did leave, they wished they'd done it sooner. One of those conversations was particularly illuminating. It was with a man named David who'd been at Meridian 10 years earlier and had left to start his own consulting firm. David was now in his late 50s and was doing work that he found genuinely interesting. I asked him what the decision had been like. I kept thinking I needed to wait for the perfect moment, David said. I kept thinking I needed to make sure I had enough saved up, enough connections, enough of a plan. But the perfect moment never came. Because there's no perfect moment to leave security and stability. You just have to choose stability less than you choose something else. What's the something else? I asked. Freedom, David said. The freedom to work on something that I believed in, even if it failed. The freedom to fail without it destroying my entire identity. The freedom to know that my worth wasn't dependent on what title I had or what company I worked for. After that conversation, I started making plans. Not to leave Meridian immediately. I'm not an idiot. I needed to be strategic. But I started thinking about what would come next. And I started building relationships with people who might become clients, colleagues, partners, and whatever came after. 3 months later, I reached out to a woman named Lisa who'd been one of my first team members at Meridian, who'd left the company 8 years earlier and was now working in the startup world. I asked her if she wanted to have coffee. She said yes immediately, like she'd been waiting for me to ask. At coffee, I told her about my situation. I told her about the restructuring, the contract, the ways I'd managed to restore my power within the system. And then I asked her if she thought there was room in the market for a consulting firm that focused on exactly this problem, helping companies understand the hidden costs of constantly restructuring their organizations, helping them build stronger cultures, helping them understand that institutional knowledge was actually valuable rather than just expensive. Lisa didn't hesitate. She said yes. She said she'd been thinking about starting something like that. She said she knew 3 other people who would be interested. She said the market needed exactly this because corporations were systematically destroying themselves by treating people like interchangeable parts and treating experience like a liability. We agreed to take a month and put together a proposal. If it looked viable, we'd start the company. If it didn't, we'd at least have explored the option. During that month, I did something I'd never done before. I had lunch with my son. I told him about the restructuring. I told him about the ways I'd fought back. And then I told him what I was thinking about doing next. I told him I was considering leaving Meridian to start a consulting firm. My son listened carefully. Then he said something that surprised me. He said he was proud of me. Not for the job or the title or the salary. He was proud of me for noticing that something wasn't working and for considering changing it. He was proud of me for being willing to risk something rather than just accepting what the system offered. When I hung up the phone after that conversation, I realized something. For years, I'd been trying to prove my worth to people who didn't actually matter. I'd been trying to impress a company that would replace me without hesitation if it became convenient. I'd been optimizing for a life trajectory that had been written by other people. And it had taken me getting old, getting tired, getting to the point where my body was showing me that time was actually finite, to realize that I should have been optimizing for something different. The consulting firm launched 6 months later. The first 6 months were uncertain. We didn't know if anyone would actually pay for what we were selling. But then we got a contract with a mid-sized tech company that was experiencing exactly the problems we were theorizing about. The company had gone through 3 rounds of restructuring in 5 years. Each restructuring had been designed to reduce costs, but each one had also somehow reduced the company's competitive effectiveness. They wanted help understanding why. That first project was when I truly understood what David had meant about freedom. I was doing work that I believed in. I was working with people who'd chosen to be there, rather than people who had to tolerate me because I had a title. I was getting paid significantly less than I would have been paid by Meridian. But I was also getting something that Meridian had never offered me, meaning. 6 months into the consulting firm, I got a call from Thomas Rothstein. He wanted to meet. I almost didn't take the meeting, but something told me I should. We met in his office, in the same building where he'd offered me the Chief Strategy Officer position years earlier. The offer to meet had given me time to consider what he might want. I'd heard through the grapevine that Meridian was going through yet another restructuring, the 3rd one in the time I'd been there. The metrics that Rothstein had been optimizing for had been achieved, costs were down, the organization was leaner, but the company's growth had also plateaued. The innovation pipeline was dry. People were leaving. The culture had turned toxic. Rothstein looked tired when I sat down in his office. He looked like I had looked years ago, like someone who'd won a battle but was slowly realizing that the victory had cost more than the battle itself. "I wanted to ask your opinion on something," Rothstein said. "Off the record." "Okay," I said. "What do you think is wrong with the company?" It was such a direct question, and it was asked with such genuine uncertainty that I actually took a moment to consider what the honest answer was, rather than what the diplomatic answer would be. I think you've spent the last 5 years optimizing for something that doesn't actually matter, I said. You've cut costs. You've created a leaner organization. But in the process, you've destroyed the things that actually made the company valuable. The institutional knowledge, the relationships between people, the sense that this was a place where people could build something meaningful. You've won on the metrics that are easy to measure. You've lost on the things that are hard to measure but actually matter. Can it be fixed? Rothstein asked. Maybe, but not quickly. Not with another restructuring. It would take the opposite of what you've been doing. It would take investment in people. It would take protecting people from being moved around constantly. It would take demonstrating that you actually care about continuity rather than just efficiency. Rothstein was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that surprised me. He said he thought I was right, and he wished he could have seen it earlier. He wished he'd understood before it was too late that the system he was designing was actually destroying the thing it was meant to optimize for. Why did you leave? He asked. Because I realized I didn't want to spend the next 10 years trying to fix a system that's fundamentally broken, I said. Because I realized that winning in that system, even if I managed it, wasn't actually going to make me happy. And because I'm 54 years old, and I finally figured out that I don't have an infinite amount of time to spend on things that don't matter to me. Rothstein nodded slowly. He didn't look offended. He looked like someone who was seeing something clearly for the first time. I envy you, he said finally. You could do the same thing, I said. No, Rothstein said. I'm too embedded. I've made choices that have locked me in. I have obligations. I have a board that's counting on me to continue optimizing for the things they care about. That's a choice too, I said. Staying is always a choice. I left his office that day and never went back to Meridian. I didn't need to. That chapter was over. I'd spent 20 years building something that I thought was a monument to my competence, my value, my worth. But I'd finally understood that worth isn't something you build inside a company. It's something you carry with you. It's something that stays with you when you leave because it's based on who you are rather than where you work. The consulting firm continued to grow. Lisa and I brought in 2 more partners. We started developing frameworks for helping organizations understand the hidden costs of constant reorganization. We started writing papers about the relationship between stability and innovation, between trust and performance. We became something of an authority on exactly the problem that had nearly destroyed me. 5 years after leaving Meridian, I got a call from David, the man who'd left Meridian 10 years before me and who'd given me the advice about not waiting for the perfect moment. David wanted to merge his consulting practice with ours. He saw what we were doing and wanted to be part of it. So we merged, and suddenly we were significantly larger, with clients across multiple industries, with a growing reputation in the market. During this same 5-year period, my son started his own company. He'd been working in tech, but he'd decided to build his own thing. He called me for advice, and I was able to give it not from the perspective of someone who had all the answers, but from the perspective of someone who'd actually lived through the decision to step away from security and build something uncertain. I'm proud of the advice I gave him. More than that, I'm proud that he felt comfortable asking. My ex-wife reached out a few years after I'd left Meridian. She wanted to catch up. We had coffee, and she told me she could see the difference in me. She said I seemed lighter, like I'd been carrying something heavy and I'd finally put it down. I told her she was right about that. I told her that for the first time in my adult life, I felt like I was working on something that was actually mine, rather than something I was trying to prove myself through. You were always trying to prove yourself, she said. Ever since I've known you. It was like you thought that if you just achieved enough, if you just got high enough on the corporate ladder, you'd finally feel like you were enough. But it doesn't work that way. I know, I said. I finally figured that out. Looking back now, at 59 years old, I can see the entire arc of what happened. The 20 years at Meridian weren't wasted. They taught me how to build something. They taught me how organizations work, how systems operate, what the incentives are that drive people's behavior. They taught me, through painful experience, what it feels like when systems don't serve the people in them. And all of that knowledge became the foundation for the work I do now, work that I find genuinely meaningful. But they also took something from me. They took years that I might have spent on other things. They took time with my son when he was younger. They took opportunities to build things that were actually mine. They took the version of me that was willing to take risks, and they gradually replaced it with a version of me that was focused on protecting what I'd already built. The phone call that changed everything, the one from Rebecca at 3:47. In the morning, that call wasn't actually the moment everything changed. The moment everything changed was years before that, when I accepted the first promotion, when I made the first choice to prioritize my career trajectory over everything else, when I decided that my worth was something I had to prove rather than something I simply possessed. But the call was the moment I became aware of what had happened. It was the moment the system's logic became visible to me, when I could no longer ignore the ways it was designed to extract value from people like me and then discard us when we were no longer useful. And that awareness, painful as it was actually a gift. It was what allowed me to make a different choice. I don't have a message in all of this. I'm not trying to tell you to leave your job or to resist your company or to assume the worst about your employers. That's not universal advice. Some people's jobs are genuinely valuable to them. Some companies are genuinely good to work for. Some systems work better than others. But I do know this. If you find yourself in a system that's slowly dismantling you, if you find yourself losing power incrementally without understanding how it's happening, if you find yourself working for people who are optimizing for things that don't actually matter, pay attention to that. Don't wait for the perfect moment to do something about it. Don't wait until you're 52 and you've already spent decades in a system that was designed to consume you. Because time is the one resource you actually can't get more of. And at some point, you reach an age where you realize that you don't have an infinite amount of it left, where you understand that your life isn't this long arc that stretches into infinity. It's finite, it's fragile. And the years you spend in systems that don't serve you are years you're not going to get back. I'm sitting in my office right now, an office that I share with Lisa and David and 3 other people who chose to be here, who could have stayed comfortable somewhere else but decided to build something uncertain instead. And I'm grateful for the path that led me here. I'm grateful for the years at Meridian because they taught me what I needed to know to do this work. But I'm also grateful for the moment I decided that enough was enough, that I didn't have to play by the rules the system had set up for me, that I could choose something different. The question I'll leave you with is this: what are you staying for? Because if the answer is just habit, just fear of the unknown, just the comfort of the familiar, that might be a sign that it's time to ask yourself what comes next.